The statutory resolution and the motion for consideration of the bill are now open for discussion. Professor M.B. Rajeev Gowda.
Deputy Chairman, sir. And through you, I want to thank the Minister for finally giving us a chance to speak on the bill. Sir, as the Minister pointed out, in society, there are many addictive substances that people like to consume. Alcohol, nicotine, tobacco, these are the different kinds of substances that people are drawn to, and these are also available in society in various forms. Some of these substances we deem to be extremely harmful, for example, drugs, narcotics, etc., and we impose a very significant ban on them. But when it comes to alcohol and tobacco, even though we know that these essentially have negative impacts, we have chosen to regulate them. We have not chosen to ban them. In certain instances, the ban on alcohol is there, prohibition, but many states have tried that, found that prohibition leads to an underground market and essentially creates mafias and all kinds of other negative impacts, and therefore they've chosen to allow alcohol to be sold. And both of these, because of the significant excise duties and taxes on these products, earn governments quite a bit of revenues as well. So, Madam, the larger issue is one of the regulation of risk. And there are so many different weapons in the armory of governments to regulate risk. The Minister gave us a little bit of the history of how tobacco regulation eventually evolved. But part of the reason was because we needed scientific proof that tobacco was actually harmful, that it was causing emphysema, cancer, various other kinds of lung diseases, which, as an ENT doctor himself, he was fully aware of. But that scientific evidence had to be there before you could actually go out and do something. So if you trace the history of regulatory interventions with tobacco, they are, basically, they start with a softer intervention like providing information, the statutory warning. Tobacco smoking may be injurious to health. That's how they started. Then, as more information started coming out, as the link between tobacco inhalation and cancer or any of these other lung diseases became evident, you started to see governments taking more drastic action. You started to see regulation of spaces from smoking and non-smoking, banning of advertising so that people are not drawn to these, to start these particular consumption of these particular products. And in his youth and in mine, all of these were very, very prominently advertised. And they used to be aspirational in many ways. People would look at the advertisements and say, my God, I could also be like that.
Glorification of smoking.
Yeah, the glorification of smoking, as my colleague is pointing out. So that was how it was sold to us, and then we stepped in as governments and banned those advertisements. Even going forward, then there was a societal change. Once it was discovered that it wasn't just the smoker enjoying himself or herself, but there was also the problem of second-hand smoke, that the person exposed to it was also being harmed. Then the government had even more of a reason, a classic externality correction reason to step in and regulate. And in that context, basically, you started to see much more aggressive measures. What were these aggressive measures? One, in terms of advertisements, as the Minister has pointed out, now India has on every cigarette pack, the branding itself is difficult to find. What you will see are gory, graphic images which turn people off from the idea of smoking by saying cigarette smoking causes a painful death, cigarette smoking causes cancer, etc. So that is one aggressive move. Another was to initially separate smoking and non-smoking areas in public spaces. And then during the UPA years, I think the Health Minister Anbumani Ramadas aggressively pushed for banning of tobacco consumption in public spaces. And that was also surprisingly implemented fairly well in this country. Given that there's not much enforcement, it has actually become a larger practice that you don't have much smoking in public spaces, thereby saving a lot of people from the harm of secondhand smoke. But if you go back 40, 50 years ago, you could smoke on planes and you could smoke on trains. These were all very much a part of what was possible and was happily accepted because the scientific cause and effect relationship was not clearly stated. So that's what we need. We need a good set of scientific studies which tell us that whatever product that we are intervening to ban or to regulate, that actually merits the kind of policy response that the government has gone forth and given us. And there, actually, we need to look at the morbidity and mortality statistics associated with the current forms of nicotine consumption through tobacco, through smoking. And what happens today, there are large numbers, crores of Indians who access nicotine through smoking of cigarettes, through smoking of bidis. And that is still regulated and allowed. There are bans on sale near schools, there are bans on sale to youngsters, etc. But other than that, this is absolutely allowed. And there is a tangible health impact for society. There is a certain amount of cost of taking care of those illnesses, and there is, of course, that huge cost of dealing with cancer and other life-threatening diseases caused by tobacco. Now, in this context, we have a new technology entering, which is these electronic delivery devices for nicotine consumption. What the smoker is after is nicotine. That is what gives the high or maintains the addiction. And however harmful it is, we have allowed people to smoke, we have allowed them to get access to nicotine, and therefore, when you find that there may be less harmful methods of delivering that same nicotine, then it's something that the government needs to pay attention to, because in the process, it might actually lower the morbidity and mortality impacts, the health costs that have to be borne by people in society, by governments themselves. So this is a larger issue of balancing risks, of trying to think through what is the cost to society of allowing a less harmful device versus banning it altogether. And I'm afraid that the minister, in the approach that has been taken in this bill, has been focused on a very, very harsh and aggressive ban rather than a consideration of this risk regulatory balancing. I've looked at some of the studies that are out there, and the first point that comes to mind is that there is a study by Public Health England which showed that e-cigarettes were found to be almost 95% less harmful than conventional cigarettes. How is this? Because essentially when you smoke a cigarette, you're also inhaling smoke, burnt products, including burnt paper. There is tar, there is carbon monoxide. There are various other contaminants that you inhale and which can cause the damage over a particular point in time. Another study that was done in the United Kingdom of a randomized trial of e-cigarettes showed that e-cigarettes have assisted people in quitting smoking successfully. Now, of course, the minister would say there are nicotine patches, there are other methods of helping people get out of their addiction to nicotine. But in this last year's economic survey, there was a whole chapter devoted to behavioral economics. Behavior is something that we need to pay attention to. How do people behave in response to various policy options? And if you can provide a behavioral option which mimics something that they're used to, which is the act of smoking, the act of blowing something out of their mouth, right? Then, and this is 95% less harmful, then this is actually something that should be possibly allowed rather than banned, because it will get people a chance to get away from the more harmful cigarette or bidi into something that would be less harmful and will allow them. No addict, I think, really wants to be addicted, but they want to find a way out. And the government could rise to the occasion and provide those alternatives that will help people get out of this addiction. The main argument that has been proffered by the minister is about children being enticed to smoke. He just gave us an example of a random check that was done in schools in Delhi, and saying so many vaping devices were found amongst the school bags. This raises this larger issue of what kind of raids are being conducted on our children, but anything is possible, obviously. The point here is, if they were not having those vaping devices, I would argue they would have cigarettes in there. Children, especially teenagers, are prone to temptation. They are prone to peer pressure to try out different kinds of intoxicants. I was a very good boy until the age of 15 when I finished my high school ICSE exam. And the day I finished that, my friend said we must celebrate with a cigarette and a drink. And at that fairly young age, I crossed that line and discovered what these addictions are all about. I am not saying anything more. My wife and family are opposed to my possible addictions, so I do not publicly acknowledge any of them. But anyway, that's the whole point. Anyway, ma'am, the point is children also are not going to be prevented from accessing tobacco just by taking away this stylish and attractive device. What you can do instead is make sure that this device is available in a very, very restrictive manner. For example, it could be available only in pharmacies and can only be possibly sold as a result of a prescription. There are ways out, which would help smokers trying to kick the habit to actually use this option to get away from their addiction. But that kind of option is not offered under this very, very drastic ban. The other argument that was given was about the United States, some recent epidemic of illnesses that have been caused by vaping devices. But there, what has actually happened is that it's not just e-cigarettes that have been used there. They have added various other substances, including cannabis-laden substances, etc. And those substances seem flavors of various kinds. The damage seems to have been caused by those substances being added rather than the actual product itself. So there, I would argue that what the minister is offering as evidence would not be applicable to India. In the United States, in some states, including cities like San Francisco that he referred to, they allow official sale and consumption of marijuana, of cannabis, of ganja, as we call it. And and that's why these particular substances were added to the e-cigarette devices in the United States. Such a situation does not exist in India. And we don't have free and legal sales, though of course we have a cultural practice of consuming marijuana in different forms at different religious and other occasions. But these sorts of contaminants are not a problem in India, and therefore the comparison and justification I would find very, very hard to go along with. So, as I mentioned, a ban, the minister says, has been adopted by about 34 countries. But 98 countries have adopted regulatory measures instead of a ban. So if you're suggesting to us, if the minister is suggesting to us that we should follow international example, then the numbers are in favor of regulation rather than a ban. And that is a point that should be noted. A ban, as we've seen everywhere, prohibition results in underground activities. It results in criminalization of society, of police, of creation of a whole mafia that deals with this underground activity. And therefore, it has to be, a ban is the last resort that you should go to rather than the first resort, which is what has been the practice in this particular context. There are so many ways we can prevent youngsters from getting anywhere near this. And what we would suggest is, what I would suggest, I'm speaking here more as an individual, is that when the nicotine levels that are possibly inhaled through these e-cigarette devices, when there is a way of sort of reducing the amount that can be consumed as well, then you can actually work with smokers and help them make their way out. So that really would be the way out of dealing with this challenge that the minister points out. And I would urge him, even now to try and think through how to actually work with smokers to reduce their illnesses, their health challenges by allowing a regulated approach rather than a ban. Thank you very much, Madam.